I'm David Pierce. This is Protocol Source Code. Anna Kramer's here. Hi, Anna.
Hey.
Who did you interview this week?
I interviewed Clementine Jacoby, who is the co-founder and CEO of Recidiviz.
Also the haver of the coolest name that we've ever had on this podcast.
Oh, my God. The best possible name.
But anyway, sorry. Okay, so she runs Recidiviz, and you get into this in the interview, but give me this sort of quick backgrounder on what Recidiviz is.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a technical nonprofit, of which there are very few in the world. And it's also a Y Combinator nonprofit, of which there are even less. And the whole point of Recidiviz is to provide open source software for prison, parole, and probation systems to manage their data, essentially.
And why is this a tech problem? Like, what made you connect to her in the first place? Why is this an interesting tech story?
Because it turns out that most of us are walking through the world assuming that everybody has sort of a handle on the data that they have. And that's just 100% not true when it comes to the things that municipal and state governments are doing, especially. And then when you think about prison systems, which have a whole lot of funding and none of it goes to technology, you realize that there are all of these people in these enormous systems, hundreds of thousands of people, who the information about them is kept on paper or in like a crappy Excel spreadsheet. And we make all of these demands of reforming the criminal justice system, which is a wonderful thing in theory, but the practicality of it involves a lot of physical data and math. And nobody can do that data or math because they have no resources. And the whole point of Recidiviz is to try to address that particular technical issue.
Got it. And she's a tech person, right? Like she's coming at this not from a sort of social justice history, but very much from like a tech history.
She's an ex-Googler.
Okay.
And she founded Recidiviz to sort of try to address this problem from the technical angle because she felt the need to be sort of more mission-oriented in her work, which obviously she wasn't really doing at Google.
Fair enough. Okay, so walk us into the interview. Where did you guys start?
Yeah, so I started by just having her explain to everybody the details of what Recidiviz does and sort of why it exists, because it's obviously a kind of weird, complicated tech product. It's the kind of thing most people don't typically think about. And she also sort of gave an overview of how her work fits into the criminal justice system and how tech fits into the criminal justice system.
Recidiviz is a technical nonprofit, and we partner with state governments to help them use their data to drive better outcomes. So our focus is corrections, which includes prisons, but also probation and parole. And so as an oversimplification, on probation, you're trying to avoid people needing to go to prison. On parole, you're trying to avoid people returning to prison. And then in prison, you're trying to make sure that people are getting set up for success, that they're getting the treatment and education they need to shorten their length of stay. So Recidiviz in particular builds an open source platform that helps these corrections leaders and their staff see in sort of realish time what's actually working to achieve those goals, which people on probation are succeeding and getting stable housing and employment, getting discharged early, where are they overwhelmingly not, which programs seem to be helping the people who are struggling, and, what would be the impact of scaling that up.
Talk me through sort of the origin story of this a little bit, because it's an open source platform and it's a nonprofit. And those are kinds of unusual things, especially, you're technically sort of just serving prison systems. This could easily be a for-profit venture, at least from the way that I understand it. So walk me through how it came about to be in this particular form and why.
Yes. We actually went through Y Combinator, and so we were told many times per day that Recidiviz could be a for-profit. I think, the short answer is that we always knew we wanted to do this as a nonprofit. Nobody at Recidiviz is here to make money. And in fact, I think everyone at Recidiviz essentially took big pay cuts to do this work. I think the important thing for us is that being a nonprofit allows us to be opinionated about what we build and to not need to sort of chase opportunities that are lucrative, but that won't, in our view, solve an important problem. And that is a very big deal. We needed to have that freedom to have the impact we wanted to have. I think the argument that's often made is you won't be able to attract the right kind of talent as a nonprofit. And in my experience, that has just not been true. I have never worked on a team this technically strong, this sort of pound for pound productive. And my experience has been that there's almost an overwhelming number of people in tech who want to use their technical skills for good, and that is the much bigger gap. That sort of top flight engineers want to make the world a better place, but they also want to report to top flight engineers, and they want to execute on complex technical problems in places with strong engineering cultures. And finding that balance of factors is actually the hard thing. And I think we have that at Recidiviz. So we've been able to get amazing people.
This is fascinating because I don't think I've ever heard anyone frame it like that before, which makes me ask you sort of, why did you go through Y Combinator with this vision? Is it because of this particular need, for excellent engineers and for the right technical skills while also being a nonprofit? It's such an unusual path. And the perspective you just shared about what people are actually looking for is one that I really don't hear very often.
So Y Combinator's mission, or the thing that they focus on, is sort of to help these young companies build something that people actually want. And my background was in, product design and user experience research. And to me, that is the biggest challenge in building something important. It's just there are so many distractions along the way to building something people want. And so the experience of going through YC was really valuable. And we were focused on trying to build something people would use. I don't think that we can have an impact unless, thousands of people are using our tools. And so for us, everything about Y Combinator was relevant to what we were trying to do. But we were the only nonprofit in the batch. But to us, it didn't feel like a wildly different experience from the one the other companies were having.
There's a lot of skepticism toward technology applied to prison systems in general. There are a lot of people who I think, in general, they think of the tech world and they think of putting that together with prison systems, and they get really freaked out, especially in the ultra more progressive side of the political spectrum. And so how do you sort of A, deal with that fear, and B, make sure that the technology is not being misused?
It's a really important question. The first thing I'll say is that the technology itself is not good or bad. And if it were that simple, it would be all much easier. And I say that less to finger wag at that framing, but more to emphasize that these dangers are super real. And we need to get more nuanced in a hurry about how we think about technology if we want to stand a fighting chance of getting this stuff right. In my view, technology will tend to make things faster and more scalable. So it can help you go from a place where you're like, man, why are so few people able to earn their way off of probation early, to a place where you can give like an individual PO a sense of who on their caseload right now might be eligible for early discharge. So the technology there is literally counting stuff. And the rest is all very thoughtful product design. It's talking to POs, it's talking to leadership, it's talking to people on supervision. It's trying to design a system that gets the right information to the right person at the right time. I think on the flip side, right, if you inject that kind of horsepower and efficiency into a process that has bad bones, you end up in a bad place much faster than you otherwise would have. So you can scale up bias very quickly. You can scale up surveillance very quickly. And it all happens so fast before you can even kind of measure these unintended consequences. You're already there. And so I think, we take this stuff like borderline obsessively seriously. At Recidiviz, our first employee did her academic research on how criminal justice algorithms could become biased and what to do about it. And so now at Recidiviz, every feature that we launch has a set of success metrics, and it also has a set of backstop metrics. So if you're launching a tool that's designed to speed up the number of people succeeding on supervision, you're also going to be measuring whether or not it is unintentionally increasing the number of Black and brown people on supervision as a sort of percentage of the whole. So we need to know both, are these tools doing what they were intended to do? And also, what are they doing that they were not intended to do? You need to measure both of those things with kind of equal fervor. And you need to do it at very short time intervals. Because again, what technology does is speed things up. And you need to know right away what's happening when you launch not just a new tool, but even a tweak or a new feature.
Okay, so you're talking about tools, which leads me to a place of, can you sort of give an example of a tool that does, for example, what you just said? Maybe we're trying to reduce the number of people who go back to prison once they're on probation. What does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so that tool in particular looks like an app that is in the hands of probation and parole officers. And to understand this, it's worth saying that what it is to be a probation officer, let's say, is sort of to be a social worker for like 110 people at once, right? It's a very overwhelming job. You're trying to place people in housing, in treatment, keep them in stable employment, and ultimately avoid folks ending up being what's called revoked to prison. So it's a very high stakes thing that you're doing, and you're doing it with a lot of people. There's also in the background this idea of the risk principle, which is that if someone's actually very low risk, you can make them, quote, worse by doing too much. And so what you really want is to find the few people on your caseload that you can really help, that you can help place in substance use treatment, and to leave alone the folks that don't need your help. So we have a tool that's called case triage that helps officers kind of organize where to put their attention. Who are the people who have had stable housing and stable employment for 6 months? Lift those people up and actually nominate them for early discharge, get them off of probation entirely so that they can go off and succeed in their lives. And similarly, rank the folks who really need your help, who has unstable housing and unstable employment, and you could intervene right now and potentially avoid an admission to prison.
Okay, so does, in general, not just this particular tool, but the bigger question of what you're trying to do here, are you achieving what you set out to do? What does that actually look like in reality?
I mean, there's no doubt that it is a thrilling time to be working in justice reform. I think there are leaders across the country that are thinking very creatively right now. There are progressives and religious communities and libertarians all sort of working side by side towards similar ends. And then COVID just forced this giant natural experiment on the system, right? We tried tons of things that we might never have tried or might not have tried for a decade if it weren't for a pandemic. So things are moving, and there's a very special kind of alignment that's making that happen. And that's all very exciting. So yes, I think it's working. And I think, there's a huge amount of stuff to be done. I also think there are lots of things that are not working, and we're trying to actually get states to stress less about that, right? It's really hard to make progress, to create more experimentation unless you can not quite embrace failure, right? Because this is government and the stakes are high. But if you want to make progress, you need to tighten the feedback loop, right? You need to be able to see which of the things that you're trying are working. And the answer can't be that you'll know 3 years from now. And so I think the core thing that recidivism is really helpful for is just giving people a sense in realer time of which of the things that they're trying are working, right? Like if you can launch a program that you think will work and see week over week whether it's happening, instead of the answer being that you'll know 3 years from now, that's the kind of thing that I think will lead to much more innovation and bigger improvements in outcomes in the space.
So over the course of the last year, even with the pandemic, what has been the sort of the hardest part? What is the area that's just been unbelievably, frustratingly challenging?
So, a little over a year ago, we started hearing about COVID. And this was way before COVID in prisons was a national headline, way before 8 of the top 10 COVID clusters were prisons and jails. But it did seem like there was a non-zero chance that an airborne pandemic in overcrowded prisons was going to be really bad. And so recidivism kind of sat down over a weekend, and we took a bunch of cruise ship data and data from the 1918 Spanish flu in San Quentin, and we tried to give folks a tool that would give them a basic sense of how many people were going to get sick. And then we released this tool, and we braced for impact. And, exactly the way that this story played out, which was that COVID hit prisons extremely hard. And suddenly the exact people that we work for and work with were in a really hard position of high responsibility, decisions that needed to be made at high speed. And, the big thing that the data showed was that really what would slow the spread was early releases. And that makes sense, right? You had to de-densify these facilities. So we helped them sort of understand how early releases would help and use that to create a conversation within states and across agencies about what needed to be done. We helped the states that we were in use their data to identify people who could be safely released. And then importantly, we also used data to help track how those folks did in the community. Going back to this idea that if you want leaders to do things, you need to give them the tools to see whether or not those things are working. And so, I think on the one hand, everything about the pandemic was hard and it was a bad time to be in corrections or in prison. On the other hand, we learned so much more about how this system works when we're all focused on de-densifying facilities than we could have in any other year's worth of time. A lot has been learned during COVID. And so I think it's a big opportunity to think about how we move forward.
What happened with all these early releases that you all helped facilitate? Do you think there's going to be, this data is going to help more people get out of prison earlier now that you've been able to prove something over the last year? Were you able to prove something?
So we're just starting to look at the data across more states now. But in the states where we've been tracking this all along, the people are doing fine. And not only are they doing fine, recidivism right now is much lower than it was a year ago, but the people released early also seem to have a slightly lower recidivism rate than people released at the same time on schedule. And if that trend continues to hold, and that's a big if, right? A lot more analysis is needed, that's a very important thing to have learned. Another important thing that the data seems to show is that of the data that we've looked at, and there were about 45,000 early releases from prison during COVID. Of the ones that we've looked at, the folks who were released early look very similar on paper to the people who were released on schedule. And what that's telling you from a data perspective is that we were in no way scraping the bottom of the barrel here, as it were, right? There were lots of people, there were at least 45,000 people that were deemed as very low risk by professionals that did have a place to go stay, that are doing fine in the community. And I think that's, an extremely important thing to have learned, especially on such an accelerated timescale.
And so you say you're going really deep in 7 states. Does this mean that you guys are involved in every single prison system in a state? What does that look like? Maybe give me one state as an example.
Yeah, so it does. So I'll give you North Dakota as an example. I talk about North Dakota a lot because I love them and they were our first state. So, when we first got to North Dakota, there was really one woman in the state, and her name was Wanda, who knew how to calculate recidivism for North Dakota. And Wanda was also retired. And that's not totally atypical of a smaller state with not a huge budget, right, to dedicate to data. And so within a few months, they had not only sort of real-time metrics for tracking things like recidivism, but a dashboard that they could use at the leadership level to track their goals. They could drill down to the individual prison level. They could also drill down to the individual supervision district level, right? What's happening county to county? What's happening across different judicial districts? How are different officers behaving in different parts of the state? Where do we have great substance use treatment and where do we not? And where really are people succeeding and what's leading to that success? But then, in addition to those tools, during the pandemic, they were positioned to move very quickly. North Dakota was right at the forefront of states that safely and thoughtfully and very methodically quickly reduced their prison population by about 25% in a matter of weeks. It was fast and it was thoughtful and it was very data driven, and they immediately started tracking how these folks were doing. and, have been weekly since then. And then, in the current legislative session, they were able to bring data to bear on, the problems at a sort of legislative macro level, right? Which are the programs that are leading to success, and bolster funding for those programs at a time when lots of rehabilitation is getting cut due to budget cuts. So I think, every state is in a different place on their data-driven journey. Some of them are just getting started. Some of them are very, very deep. But that's kind of what it looks like to roll out recidivism in a state.
Okay, that makes sense. And so do you envision recidivism in all 50 states? Do you see other nonprofits coming up that do similar things to you? What do you want this landscape to look like eventually?
At the moment, we're just taking one step at a time. And I think the really big focus is making sure that the states that we're in are getting what they need. If another startup rises up and outcompetes us, I would welcome it. Like, this is extremely hard work. Every state is very different. And the jobs that corrections leaders and probation and parole officers have are hard. And the challenges that people who are on supervision and in prison are facing are even harder. And so I definitely want to see more entrants into this ecosystem. I think we talked about this earlier, but tech has good and bad roles to play in this ecosystem. And I'm excited to see a lot of emerging discussion about that and a lot of thoughtfulness about how to handle it. But yeah, I'd like to see recidivism grow. But for now, I'd like to see recidivism really, really help states think about how to move forward from COVID. I think as a field, that's our big opportunity right now. We just ran this giant natural experiment, the scale of which we'll probably never see again. So, a lot of bad happened, but a lot of innovation happened too. And I just think, like so many sectors, the criminal justice field is trying to figure out how we move forward in the most thoughtful possible way.
Yeah, in like a really weird way, you're one of the tech companies that had not a good pandemic year, because that's not, obviously it sucked for prisons and everybody in them, but something happened and that may be positive for everybody in the long term.
Definitely.
And so I wanted to ask, we almost never talk about the people who run prisons as a society. I think when we talk about prisons, we talk of them as existing and we talk about the people who are inside them. But the people who are in charge of, making them work and of the people who are inside them is something I think we sort of shy away from socially to talk about. And so you work with these people all the time. And so I wanted to ask you, right, what is it that, if you were telling the world what you hear that prison administrators want from people in the tech industry, from society as a whole, right? What is that? What do they want from, let's start with tech.
Well, that's such a good way to ask that question. And I totally agree that it's a question that doesn't really get asked enough because, we as society do expect a lot from these people. And we do, in my opinion, know very little about what their jobs are, or at least I did, 3 years ago. I think the people who run corrections departments, and again, that's all three things, prisons, probation, and parole in many cases, I think they want to know what's working.
Yeah.
It's like being the CEO of a company that has thousands of employees that's launching all kinds of products and having no sense of which of those products are being used. And furthermore, the stakes being quite high. And furthermore, these are people who basically never get good press and quite frequently get bad press. And so it's not surprising that it's a fairly risk-averse job, right? Because if you think about what it really means to do that job, it's like the hardest jobs in the world are the ones where you have tons of responsibility and very little control, in a sense, right? So what Recidivist does is we go in and say, what are you trying to get done in 2021? And they say things like, I am trying to reduce the number of people coming to prison from probation for infractions that could have been avoided. And then we start getting them a real-time picture of what's happening today and diagnosing the bottlenecks and answering their questions. And I think that's what they want from us, at least, right? Like there are there are corrections, research, and data teams across the country. Every state has one. And these people are heroes. Like, they are inundated with work. They are trying desperately to keep up with requests from these policymakers who want to know if a bill had an intended impact or how it would change costs, or if the things we're spending money on as a state are helping people. And what are we doing to reduce racial disparities? And it's hard to overstate exactly how difficult these questions are to answer right now. And I think when I started working on recidivism, I had a real lack of understanding about that. I thought that what was going on was that the people who led the system, of course, did understand these things. I was coming from Google. What did I know about, I thought they had dashboards and alerts and all of these things that I had as a product manager to know which of the things I was trying were working. And they very often have none of that. And so I think what they want, at least from us, is to know what's working and to know it faster, and that those are the things that they need to actually drive the results that society is asking them for, that policymakers are asking them for. So it's been, for me, a real frame shift, I would say, in understanding what those jobs are, and how to best help. And I could say exactly the same thing about probation and parole officers, by the way, right? I had a real lack of understanding about what that job was and what would it mean to try to help 110 people at once who are in various unstable situations. What would it mean to help them succeed? And how would you go about trying to do that? And how could technology help you with that? And I think once you start asking the question that way, and this is classic user-centered design, right? This is something that tech does really well when we are thoughtful. Once you start asking the question that way, you see lots of opportunity.
Okay. And I think that leads naturally into sort of the very big question looming over this, which is, within the last year, we didn't just have the pandemic. We had sort of an awakening racial justice movement that involved this idea of abolish the police became sort of, I think, for the first time, a more popular notion instead of just an academic one. And there, I think, people who take perspectives, a whole range in terms of, exactly what can be done to sort of reduce the carceral state, or if we should, and what that should look like. But I think your average person doesn't know much about it, aside from there's this theory that perhaps we could get rid of law enforcement as we know it. And I think sort of tucked in there is discussions of prison systems and wanting to end prison systems. But we don't hear that much long critical conversation about what that would look like and what the practicalities of that are. And so I wanted to know what you think of this conversation that's been happening over the last year and where you fit into it. And maybe you personally, maybe recidivists, but I'm sure that you have a perspective here that perhaps the average person is not hearing. And so I'm very curious to know sort of how you interpret what's been happening and what you hope to see, practically speaking.
Yeah, there's so much to say. One thing that's clear is that it's good for more people to care and to get involved in the conversation. The other thing is that I'm not a policing expert. I focus much more on other parts of the system. But I do think that the idea that, we could reimagine what these roles really are. And I've talked about this a little bit in the probation context, but I will say that probation officers are very excited about the idea that their job could be a little bit less catch folks who are doing things wrong and a lot more help people succeed, help people avoid prison, help people get stable housing and stable employment. I talk to a lot of POs, and I do not hear them saying that they want to catch people for doing things wrong. I hear that they got into the job to do something that looks much closer to social work. And so I think the idea of reimagining these roles and empowering people and training people and giving them the resources that they need to do a very different job, and in many ways a harder job, which is to help people who are in unstable conditions, unstable situations succeed, is a good one that everyone can embrace. I think the other piece of this is that something that's so special about criminal justice reform, and this was true before last summer, but I think is especially true now, is that there is this serious nonpartisan momentum. And that is so powerful. There are very few issues like this in the United States where you have people with very different views working towards similar outcomes. And I think that that is critical, and I think that it is fragile. And so I think that what I feel is important is that we are listening super hard to people who are coming at this from different angles, but want the same things that we do. And that is the thing that the field has done such a good job of crafting so far. They've been able to make progress because they've been able to do that. And, from my, of course, overly pragmatic being a computer scientist lens, I think it's also really important that we keep looking at the evidence, that we sort of tighten the feedback loop and really get structured about making sure that we are not moving based on anecdote, and that we are moving based on tackling the biggest problems, and also that we're listening to the people who are actually in the system, both the people who are practitioners working in it and the people whose lives are caught up in it.
Okay. And that, I think, opens the door for one last question, which is for people who are sort of younger and in the technology space, perhaps the age that you were when you founded Recidivists. What do you say to those who do have this sort of philosophy of wanting to do good mission-driven work in tech while also working, with really talented engineers? This topic that we talked about at the beginning. What should they be thinking about and looking at and trying to do if they want to be doing perhaps sort of the path that you have done?
Yeah. So what I will say is that I was not a person who thought that I would found something, and that the way that me and my co-founders ended up starting Recidivists was just by trying to be helpful to people in the field doing good work who are smarter than us. So instead of starting out and saying, we're really clever, I bet we can come up with a good idea, we just went to people who had problems that they were trying to solve, and we tried to accelerate their progress. And that ended up doing a lot of things. One, we just learned a ton about how this work was being done, and we got to avoid lots of things that had already been tried, so that by the time Recidivists was spun out as an independent nonprofit, we had a pretty strong point of view on where we could be helpful, and it wasn't our idea. It had been informed by, academics in the space, researchers in the space, practitioners, advocates, people who were actually doing work to help government agencies. So I think that's one piece that I recommend. A related piece is just, this idea of listening. We have had people like the Council of State Governments help us along the way to really establish a point of view and figure out where technology can play a role and where it's not needed. And both of those are equally important, right? You need to have trusted partners who are domain experts, I think, as a technology outfit. You should not go it alone. You should find the people who know what they're talking about and who have a strong point of view because they've been doing this work for 30 years and this is the data that they need. So I think, my recommendation is basically to trust your technical instincts and know what you do well, but to also know what you do not know, and to go find people who know the things you don't know and partner with them.
Well, that I think is a really great place to end it. So thank you so much for making the time. And it was really great to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Clementine and Anna, and thank you so much for listening. As always, you can subscribe to Source Code anywhere you get podcasts. Please rate us if that's a thing you can do, and sign up to get the Source Code email newsletter in your inbox every morning at protocol.com/newsletters. Have a great one. We'll talk to you soon.